Hi, my name is Sarah Elizabeth Jackson, and this is my disability project and presentation for SPED 6010 fall semester. So just to begin, I have this little box up here, and I have to have that there so I can see my time of my presentation. So I'm sorry, it will get in the way of some of the slides, and it's really just the title of it. It will not affect any of the content of the slide, but I am sorry that that is happening. But I've tried really hard to get rid of it, and I could not. So let's move on to the presentation. So first, I will be discussing the presentation layout of my presentation. So first, let's begin. I will first be discussing an analysis of the case study, and then I will have an analysis of the disability. I will also then be discussing the parent's perspective of the student in the school setting, and then also a school personnel perspective of the student or the case study. After that, I will have appropriate accommodations and modifications for the student in the school setting. And then finally, I will have behavioral and academic strategies that can lead the student for success in the general education setting. And then after that, I will have my resources. So let's begin with an analysis of the case study and the disability. So the case study. The child's pseudonym here is Philip. He's in the 4th grade and he is age 10. His current diagnosed disability is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. He is eligible for other services as other health impaired, also known as OHI. This is due to his diagnosis of ADHD. The parents are following up with outside testing for auditory processing disorder, also known as ADP. The reason why the parents are doing this is because ADP's symptoms and ADHD can mask or intensify each other. And so it's very important that Philip receives the proper diagnosis so the school personnel and parents can make changes to his lifestyle in order to help him function better and do better in school. So now I'm going to focus though mainly for this presentation on ADHD. So for the disability, characteristics of ADHD. One of the main characteristics of ADHD is inattention, which is the inability to focus or concentrate. Students who are displaying inattention often have difficulty sustaining attention. They also are careless, and they also make chronic careless mistakes, and they do not listen when directly spoken to at all times. Now, they do have the ability to do that, but if it's constant, then they might lose that ability to do so. One of the characteristics of ADHD is impulsivity, which is the inability to control one's behavior. Characteristics of this in a classroom setting would be the tendency to blurt out answers whenever a teacher asks a question. And also, another characteristic of impulsivity in the classroom is answering questions before the question is completely asked. The student is so excited and they're worried that they're going to lose the answer in their head that they instantly just shout out the answer before the teacher has a chance to finish asking the question. Then also another symptom of impulsivity is not waiting for their turn. So you can see this often in games where the student is so impatient because of their impulsivity and they got to get it out of their system that they go ahead and try and take their turn. They do not wait. Another characteristic of a student with ADHD is hyperactivity. This is excessive motor movement, so the student feels the need to always move. They have excessive fidgeting. They also squirm in their seat a lot. I have seen this personally where they leave their seats while others remain seated. This is often at inappropriate times. They also run or climb whenever it's often inappropriate or at inappropriate times. And the student needs to feel the need to be continuously in motion due to their hyperactivity. So now we're going to move to parent and school perspective. So we're going to begin with the parent perspective of the student at school. So firstly, Philip started receiving special education services in 2010. This was when he was in pre-K. They decided to test him because he was having trouble focusing and also having behavior problems in his special education classroom. When I asked the mother what types of tests they conducted on Philip for special education services, it was ADHD, developmental delay, which was DD, also known as, speech, occupational therapy, OT, and then they also did an IQ test on him. So after all those tests, he was diagnosed initially with ADHD. And the results of all these tests were explained to her at a meeting that was designed to see whether or not Philip needed an individualized education program, also known as an IEP. So now I will be discussing Philip's parents' perspective on the school and whether or not their needs have met. The parent feels that Philip is receiving the special education services that their child needs. They also feel that the parent is an active member of the child's IEP team and during the meetings. The parent feels that the school fully implements the IEP and also feels that the teachers fully implements the IEP. The parent also feels that the teacher is aware of all of Philip's needs, and the parents also know their rights as parents. So that's very important whenever a parent is new to a program such as an IEP, they need to know their rights as a parent and what they can do for their student. Philip receives both accommodations and modifications in the general education setting. And upon discussing this with Philip's mother, she is very happy with the services that Philip is receiving at his school from Miss Tatum. So now I will be discussing the school personnel. Her name is Miss Amber Tatum. I currently work with her. She is a resource teacher. She teaches grades 3 and 4, and she has been working since 2015 in the school system. So I'm first going to discuss what Miss Tatum provides. So Miss Tatum provides pull-out services for both reading and math. She uses targeted and explicit instruction to help close the gaps in her resource room. Specifically for Philip, she is the case manager. She plays a lead role in all of his IEP meetings. She discusses current performance roles and then also leads discussions concerning services and accommodations for Philip. She is also in charge of drafting plans while putting together input from both the school personnel and parents. And I think that would actually be very difficult to do, to put all these ideas together and then put it all into one document that says it all. She also drafts annual goals that must be measurable and specific to each area of the deficit. And that is actually very important when constructing an IEP. Then also she is responsible to track progress towards those goals. So a vast majority of Miss Tatum's students, accommodations are to lessen the impacts in the general education class. These accommodations are provided by the general education teacher. However, Miss Tatum consults with the general education teacher to assure that they are making progress in those goals. Miss Tatum also differentiates depending on their level of need. She uses lots of visual cues to verbal information for those who struggle to learn by auditory means. For Philip, she provides color overlays when requested to cut contrast and background to text. So he has to ask for that accommodation, but she provides it whenever he wants it. Then Philip also needs frequent redirection back to task. All right, So some behavior management that Miss Tatum provides. She said that she uses a very simple management system in her room. She uses the phrase and hand signal, give me 5. It means eye contact on the teacher, ears ready to listen, mouth closed, hands still, and seat in the seat. She also emphasizes mutual respect for all in her classroom. And she also gives out brag tags, which she gives out for excellent effort, excellent behavior, excellent kindness, and other positive behaviors that she wants to support in her classroom. So Miss Tatum's communication with her students' future teachers. She discusses with the future teacher the student's strengths and the weaknesses before they leave the classroom. That means her classroom. She does this before they reach middle school. That's very important to her. She believes that the future teacher needs to know the student's background and what works well for them. Specific to Philip's future, Miss Tatum feels that his future is bright due to his involved, aware, and motivated family. Philip may continue to struggle with attention and therefore his grades. However, she believes that he will have a happy and fulfilling life. And she also says, and this is just in general about Philip, that he has a very sweet nature and strengths in areas where he can shine. And so Miss Tatum actually feels that Philip has a bright future ahead of him, despite his disability. So now I'm going to move on to appropriate accommodations and modifications for students with ADHD. So this is just a broad overview. It's not specific to Philip. So accommodations. First, let's have a definition of what an accommodation is. I always like to refer back to the book because it's important to know the difference between accommodations and modifications. So, accommodations are defined as any changes made to the instruction or materials that do not change the curriculum expectations. And this is where I see most people get the definitions of accommodations and modifications wrong. So, it's not changing the curriculum. So, types of accommodations for students with ADHD. So, I have it grouped into some categories. So, for classroom learning, teachers would need to have students sit close to the teacher, away from windows and doors. Teachers need to have space between desks so the student can fidget and move around. Teachers should stand near the student with the teacher. And then provide student with footrest, seat cushions, or resistance bands on chair legs. And I've seen this used in the classroom before. The student just simply puts their foot on the band and they can move it up and down. And that gives them that motor movement that they're desiring right now. Some other accommodations. So for organizations, teachers can use assignment notebooks that's specific to the assignment or specific to the subject. They can also provide an extra set of books to keep at home. So students with ADHD struggle with keeping up with things. So if they just had a set of books that they kept at home and a set of books that they kept in school, that takes out the losing the books. And then also it allows them to work on their homework or work on their schoolwork instead of having to borrow books. Color code materials is also very useful when working with students with ADHD. And then another accommodation that could be used for organization would be to provide schedule of daily routines for the student. That way they know what to expect and when to expect it. So now we'll move on to accommodations for classwork and taking tests. So worksheets could have fewer questions and problems, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easier. It just means let's get more to the point. Let's make sure that they know the subject that we're talking about. So we're not making it easier. We're just making it less all at once. Then another accommodation that I really liked that I found was frequent short quizzes. So that instead of having one giant long test for the student to take, you can just quiz them periodically, and then that way you still know that they know the subject that you're trying to teach. However, they're not expected to know it all in one setting. You could also provide the student with extra time and also give them a quieter space to take tests, because I've felt this way before, where you're in a certain space and you just hear someone move, and it's not even them trying to be loud, it's just movement, and that distracts you from what you're actually trying to do. So imagine it for our students with ADHD, how hard that would be. You can also give them extra credit for work done instead of taking away points for late or partial work. So I figured this was very important to have. Teachers often want to penalize students, and I don't think it's wise to do that for a student with ADHD. They have trouble concentrating. So you shouldn't penalize them for having late work or partial work. You should just get them to do it again. However, if they actually do the work, you need to give them extra credit, because that was a lot for them to complete in a timely manner. So some more accommodations for in-class learning. You can give out directions out loud or in writing. You can use pictures and graphs. You could give the student an outline of the lesson so then they can make notes as it goes along. You can also keep instructions simple and clear, and that is very key with working with students with ADHD. For behavior, you can use a behavior plan with a reward system. I work with students with ADHD, so if you give them a goal and that goal is instantaneous, that works well with them. You need to praise them for their good behavior. Ignore the other behaviors as long as it's not disruptive, because it's really not fair for that student if they get in trouble for something that really is part of their disability. So a student calling out, that is part of their disability. So if they're being disruptive with it, yes, you need to discipline them. However, if it's just a simple, they called out a little tiny word and you can ignore it, I encourage you to do so. You also need to talk through their behavior problems one-on-one. No one likes to be called out in front of people, so it's important that you have that one-on-one time with them and build that relationship with them and work on their behavior problems together. You also need to monitor frustration with the student. These students can become particularly frustrated just because they might constantly be getting onto, and that's not fun. You also need to check in with the student to see if they understand. Just every once in a while when you're walking around, check to see if the student is frustrated with their work, and if they are, see what you can do to make accommodations for them. So next we'll move on to modifications. And the book defines modifications as significant changes made to the instruction or materials that result in the student no longer meeting the standards of the general education curriculum. And now this is very important. We try as educators not to do this, but it does sometimes happen. But when you can, try not to do a modification. Try to make an accommodation for the student. So types of modifications for students with ADHD. So for assignment modifications, you can have them complete fewer or different homework problems than peers. They can also write short papers, answer fewer or different test questions, and create alternate projects or assignment for that particular student. Other types of modifications, for curriculum modifications, they can learn different material. So for an example of this would be continuing to work on a particular skill that the classmates already know, the other general education classmates already know. This would be like working on multiplication when they're moving on to fractions. Students can get graded or assessed using a different standard than one from their peers. And they also may be excused from particular projects. But again, we want to try and limit the times that we have to do this. So for test modifications, I found this quite interesting. It's best to use multiple choice questions or tests, because then they can use the test to answer questions and that jogs their memory. I thought that was very neat. You need to let the students use, you can also let the students use a small laminated card that contains secondary information. So this would just be a card that they would have that would help them take the test. It's not necessarily, it does help them, but it doesn't cause them not to prove that they don't know. So an example of this would be the card may contain information such as formulas, acronyms, grammar rules, but then they still have to answer questions that may be on that card. So now I'm going to move on to behavior and academic strategies for students with ADHD. So types of behavior strategies for students with ADHD, I broke it down into prevention strategies and reinforcement strategies. So some prevention strategies would be nonverbal supports. Give them choice as a reward. I found this interesting. Check with chimes, reminders on electronic devices, so that would be an alarm. You can also use visual and environmental props. Proximity control is also very important. You can use timers, and music is also an excellent prevention strategy for behaviors. You can also use reinforcement strategies. So this would be plenty of praise, a lot of communication with home, and verbal praise, verbal redirections, and corrective feedback. So academic strategies with students with ADHD, when giving directions, you could limit the number of directions given, provide written directions, and provide visual models of the assignment. With written assignments, you can limit the amount of paper, limit the amount of work per page, cover up part of the work on the page, provide work breaks, or reduce length of written assignment. For organization, you can provide assignment notebooks, color-coded folders, homework partners, clean-out dates. So these are days in which they clean up their work area. And you can also provide them with a checklist of supplies so then they know what they should and should not have. So in conclusion, first we discussed an analysis of the case study and the disability. We discussed the parent's perspective and the school personnel perspective. I discussed appropriate accommodations and modifications for the student. And then I also discussed behavioral and academic strategies that can lead the student for success in the general education setting. And I just want to say that it was a joy to get to interview a teacher that I've worked with before. And it's just a joy to get to know her perspective on special education services. And so here are my resources. I used various online articles for my accommodations and modifications. And then I also used our book, and I also used the Tennessee Disability Handbook for my presentation. Thank you.